Marcus Hale tore the boarding pass in half. The sound of the paper ripping cut through the quiet boarding gate like something sharper than it should have been. For a moment, the conversations around us slowed, then stopped entirely. People turned. A few passengers near the counter stared openly, unsure if they had just witnessed something private or something they were supposed to pretend they hadn't seen. Marcus didn't lower his voice when he spoke. "You'll fly economy," he said flatly. "You should be grateful I even paid for the ticket." The words hung in the air longer than the torn paper he dropped to the floor. A woman standing near the boarding line gasped softly. Another man glanced at me, then quickly looked away the way strangers do when they suddenly realize they've stepped into the middle of someone else's humiliation. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I bent down slowly and picked up the 2 pieces of the boarding pass from the airport floor. The edges of the paper were jagged where Marcus had torn them. For a second, I held them in my hand, staring at the printed destination as if it belonged to someone else's life. Marcus had already turned away from me, scrolling through his phone as if nothing unusual had happened. I slipped the torn pieces of paper into my purse, because in that moment I understood something he clearly didn't, but I didn't realize yet how much that moment at the airport would quietly change everything that came after. My name is Valerie Hart. I'm 51 years old, and until that morning at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, I thought I understood the life I had built with my husband. If you're watching from somewhere, tell me your city in the comments. I always like seeing where people are listening from. And if you enjoy stories like this one, consider subscribing. Marcus and I had been married for 16 years. From the outside, our life looked like the kind of success story people liked to talk about. We lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside Seattle, the kind with tall trees lining the streets and houses that looked comfortable without trying too hard to show off. Marcus ran a logistics company called North Star Freight Solutions. Over the past decade, it had grown steadily from a small operation with a handful of trucks to a company that handled freight contracts across several states. Investors had started paying attention. New deals were appearing on Marcus's calendar almost every week. People often assumed Marcus had built the company alone. I rarely corrected them. In the early years before North Star had an office or even a proper warehouse, our dining room table had doubled as Marcus's workspace. Contracts, invoices, and shipping schedules would spread across the wood surface, while I tried to keep them organized into neat stacks. Back then, success felt fragile. Marcus drove trucks himself during those first months. Sometimes he'd come home long after midnight smelling like diesel and exhaustion. I handled the paperwork, tracking deliveries, sending emails, making sure bills were paid on time. Neither of us talked about sacrifices. We just assumed they were temporary. Over time, the company grew. Marcus hired managers, opened a larger warehouse near the port, and eventually moved the business operations into a sleek office downtown. By then, our lives had started to look very different from those early days. Our son Ethan was 16 now. He had inherited Marcus's height and my habit of observing things quietly before speaking. Most afternoons, he disappeared into his room with homework or music, occasionally wandering downstairs to ask if we had anything to eat. Like many families, we had fallen into comfortable routines. Marcus traveled often for business meetings, Chicago, Dallas, sometimes overseas. I stayed closer to home, managing the parts of our life that didn't show up on financial statements, school schedules, house repairs, birthdays, the 1,000 small details that quietly keep a family running. None of that felt unusual. And until the airport incident, I had believed Marcus and I still understood each other the way people do after years of marriage without needing to explain everything out loud. The trip that morning was supposed to be simple. Marcus had been invited to meet representatives from Meridian Global Capital, a large investment firm considering a major expansion deal with North Star Freight Solutions. The meeting would take place in Geneva. According to Marcus, it could potentially change the future of the company. He had insisted we travel together. Investors like seeing stability, he had told me the week before. It looks better when they see the founder's family is involved. At the time, I didn't question the explanation. Now, standing at the boarding gate with the torn pieces of paper in my purse, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. Marcus hadn't sounded angry when he spoke. He had sounded dismissive, as if my place beside him had always been temporary. The boarding announcement came only a few minutes after Marcus tore the ticket. Passengers began lining up in quiet rows, holding their passports and phones, pretending not to notice the uncomfortable silence that had settled around us. The woman who had gasped earlier kept glancing in my direction, as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure what. Marcus stepped into the business class line without looking back. For a moment I remained standing where I was, my purse still resting against my side, the torn boarding pass inside it like a small reminder of what had just happened. Then I walked toward the economy line. No one said anything to me, but I could feel the weight of strangers' curiosity in the air. People have a way of sensing tension even when they don't understand the details. A middle-aged man near the back of the line shifted slightly to give me space. "Long flight," he said quietly, as if offering a small kindness without asking questions. I nodded. "Yes," I replied. "It will be." When the agent scanned my passport, she hesitated for a moment. Her eyes flicked toward the torn edge of the boarding pass I had carefully taped back together with a strip of clear tape I found in my purse. Then she looked up at me again. "Have a good flight, Ms. Hart," she said gently. The kindness in her voice almost surprised me more than the humiliation itself. Inside the plane, the cabin lights were soft and dim. People were already settling into their seats, placing bags in overhead compartments, and adjusting seatbelts with the familiar impatience of travelers eager for the journey to begin. My seat was near the back. I slid into the narrow space beside the window and placed my purse on my lap. The engines outside the aircraft hummed quietly, a steady vibration that seemed to fill the silence in my thoughts. For several minutes, I simply stared at the runway lights through the oval window. Marcus was somewhere near the front of the plane, seated in business class. I could imagine the wider seats, the glasses of water being offered before takeoff, the quiet conversations between passengers who were used to traveling comfortably. In 16 years of marriage, Marcus and I had flown together dozens of times. Never like this. A flight attendant walked past checking seat numbers. When she reached my row, she paused for a moment. "Everything okay here?" she asked. Her voice was polite routine, but something in her expression suggested she might have noticed more than she said. "Yes," I replied. She gave a small nod and continued down the aisle. The plane began to move a few minutes later, slowly pushing away from the gate. The cabin lights dimmed further as the safety instructions played on the overhead screens. As the aircraft turned toward the runway, I finally opened my purse and looked at the torn boarding pass again. Marcus's name was printed clearly on the original booking confirmation that had been emailed to both of us days earlier. 2 business-class seats. He had changed the reservation that morning without telling me. That detail settled quietly in my mind. Outside the window, the runway lights blurred as the aircraft accelerated. When the plane lifted into the air, Seattle disappeared beneath a blanket of clouds. For the next several hours, the cabin remained dim and quiet. Passengers slept, watched movies, or scrolled through their phones while the plane moved steadily across the sky. I didn't sleep. Instead, I found myself replaying small moments from the past few months, conversations Marcus had ended too quickly, business trips that seemed to appear suddenly, phone calls he had stepped outside to take. None of those things had seemed important before. Now they lingered in my thoughts like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together the way they once had. About halfway through the flight, I stood and walked slowly toward the front of the cabin, not all the way to business class, just far enough to stretch my legs. From where I stood near the curtain dividing the cabins, I could see Marcus a few rows ahead. He was leaning slightly toward the woman sitting beside him, speaking in a low voice. She laughed at something he said. The sound was soft, but it carried just enough for me to hear it over the quiet hum of the plane. I watched them for only a few seconds. The woman was younger, early 30s perhaps, with dark hair pulled neatly behind her shoulders. Marcus seemed relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. He didn't notice me standing there. I turned and walked back to my seat. For the rest of the flight, I kept my eyes on the window. Clouds stretched endlessly beneath the plane, illuminated occasionally by the faint silver glow of moonlight. Somewhere over the Atlantic, a strange calm settled over me. Not the kind that comes from understanding something clearly, but the quiet stillness that appears when a person realizes there are questions they can no longer ignore. When the plane finally began its descent toward Europe, the cabin lights brightened and passengers slowly woke from their restless sleep. People gathered their belongings, adjusted jackets, and prepared for landing. Life continued moving forward, just as it always does. Yet something had shifted. I could feel it. And as the aircraft touched down on the runway thousands of miles from Seattle, I realized the humiliation at the airport hadn't been the end of something. It had only been the beginning. For years I had believed silence was the same as patience, but somewhere during that long flight, I began to understand that silence can also be the moment when a person starts seeing the truth more clearly. When the plane landed, the quiet tension of the flight dissolved into the usual rhythm of travel. Passengers reached for their bags and shuffled slowly down the aisle while the cabin lights brightened. Marcus was among the first people to leave the business class section. By the time I stepped into the terminal, he was already several yards ahead, moving through the airport with the confident pace of someone who traveled often. He didn't wait for me. That detail lingered longer than it should have. Outside the airport, a line of taxis waited beneath the gray morning sky. Geneva looked calm and orderly in the early light, the streets still quiet as the city slowly woke. Marcus gave the driver the name of the hotel. The Four Seasons, he said. His voice carried the same neutral tone he had used at the boarding gate, as if the incident in Seattle had been something minor, something already forgotten. During the drive, Marcus scrolled through emails on his phone while the driver navigated the narrow streets along the lake. I watched the buildings pass by the window, their pale stone facades reflecting the soft light of morning. Neither of us mentioned the airport. Neither of us mentioned the torn ticket. It was strange how easily silence could settle between two people who had once shared everything. By the time we reached the hotel, Marcus had already shifted fully into his business persona, the calm, focused version of himself that investors and partners expected to see. "This meeting is important," he said, while checking his watch in the lobby. "I'll probably be gone most of the afternoon." I nodded. "That's fine." It wasn't unusual for Marcus to spend long hours in meetings during trips like this. In fact, that part of our life had become routine. Marcus had always been ambitious. When we first met, he was working as a logistics coordinator for a regional shipping company in Tacoma. Back then, he talked often about the inefficiencies he saw in the freight industry, how contracts were structured poorly, how routes could be optimized, how smaller companies were overlooked by investors. He had ideas. Lots of them. I remember one evening early in our relationship when we sat at a small diner near the waterfront, long after most of the other customers had gone home. Marcus had spread a few handwritten notes across the table, sketching out what he imagined a better logistics company could look like. "I just need the chance to build something," he said. The determination in his voice had been impossible to ignore. At the time, I admired that confidence. When Marcus eventually left his job to start North Star Freight Solutions, the decision felt risky but exciting. We didn't have investors yet, and the first trucks Marcus leased were older vehicles that required constant repairs. Sometimes we worked late into the night at our dining room table surrounded by paperwork and empty coffee cups. Back then, success wasn't guaranteed, but the effort felt shared. As the company grew, the pace of our lives changed. Marcus hired managers, moved operations into a larger warehouse near the Seattle port, and began traveling more frequently for business development meetings. At first, I accompanied him on some of those trips: conferences in Chicago, client dinners in Los Angeles, occasional meetings with shipping partners along the West Coast. Those trips had once felt like small celebrations of progress, but over time the invitations became less frequent. Marcus explained it simply. "Most of these meetings are just numbers and contracts," he said one evening while packing for a flight to Dallas. "You'd be bored." I accepted the explanation without much thought. Our son Ethan was growing older by then, busy with school and sports. Staying home felt practical, and Marcus's work schedule had become demanding. There were always new contracts to negotiate, new routes to expand, new investors to impress. Still looking back now, there were moments when something subtle had begun to shift. Small details I hadn't questioned at the time, like the way Marcus sometimes stepped outside to take phone calls instead of answering them in the living room, or how he began traveling with only a small carry-on bag, even for trips that lasted several days. Once, about 6 months before the Geneva meeting, I noticed a name appear repeatedly in Marcus's calendar reminders: Alyssa. At the time, I assumed she was a colleague or someone involved with the company's investor relations. North Star had been growing quickly, and Marcus often mentioned new employees I hadn't met yet. But the name appeared often enough that it eventually caught my attention. "Who's Alyssa?" I asked casually one evening while Marcus reviewed emails on his laptop. He didn't look up immediately. "A consultant," he said after a moment. "She helps coordinate some of the investor meetings." The answer seemed reasonable, so I didn't ask more questions. But over the following weeks I noticed the name again, in travel confirmations, in meeting reminders, always connected to Marcus's schedule. At the time, the detail felt insignificant. Now, sitting in the quiet hotel room in Geneva, while Marcus attended his meeting with Meridian Global Capital, I found myself remembering that name again, Alyssa. For the first time, I began to wonder whether there had been signs I had simply chosen not to see. The hotel room felt unusually quiet after Marcus left for his meeting. Through the tall windows overlooking Lake Geneva, the morning light reflected off the water in slow, silver patterns. Boats drifted lazily near the docks while people walked along the promenade, their conversations muffled by the glass. Normally, I enjoyed moments like this during Marcus's business trips. Traveling had always offered a strange kind of pause from everyday life, an opportunity to observe unfamiliar places and slow down for a while. But that morning, the silence felt different. I kept thinking about the airport, about the torn boarding pass, about the way Marcus had spoken to me in front of strangers as if I were an inconvenience rather than his wife. The memory replayed itself in small fragments. His voice, the sound of the paper tearing, the way the people around us had turned to watch. I tried to focus on something else. Instead, I opened my laptop on the desk near the window and began checking messages. There were a few routine emails from home notifications from Ethan's school reminders about a scheduled repair for the dishwasher, a short message from a neighbor asking if we had returned from our trip yet. Nothing unusual. But Marcus's calendar notification suddenly appeared on the shared family account we both used. Meeting Meridian Global Capital 10 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. Beneath it was another entry I hadn't noticed before. Lunch, Alyssa Grant. The time was scheduled immediately after the investor meeting. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Maybe it was nothing. Consultants and coordinators often joined meetings with investors. It would make sense for Marcus to continue discussing logistics over lunch. Still, something about the entry lingered in my mind. I closed the laptop and stepped outside for a walk. For a while, the simple rhythm of the city helped quiet the thoughts in my head. But when I returned to the hotel a few hours later, Marcus still hadn't come back. His meeting should have ended by now. I checked the time, 3:15 p.m. Perhaps the discussion had run longer than expected. Investors were known for extending negotiations when the numbers looked promising. I tried to convince myself of that explanation. Still, the name Alyssa appeared again in my thoughts. By late afternoon, the sunlight had shifted across the lake, turning the water a deeper shade of blue. Marcus finally returned just before 6. He walked into the room carrying the same calm confidence he always seemed to bring back from business meetings. "How did it go?" I asked. Marcus loosened his tie and placed his phone on the desk. "Better than expected," he said. "Meridian is seriously considering the expansion deal." "That's good. It could mean significant growth for North Star." Marcus spoke with the same measured enthusiasm he used whenever he described the company's progress. The conversation sounded familiar, almost rehearsed, but something about the way he avoided my eyes felt slightly different. "Did you meet the consultant you mentioned before?" I asked carefully. Marcus paused for only a fraction of a second. "Alyssa," he said. "Yes, she helped coordinate the meeting logistics." Marcus poured himself a glass of water from the bottle on the table. "Investors like her work," he added casually. "She's efficient." The answer was simple, too simple perhaps. I didn't press further. Instead, we ordered dinner from the hotel restaurant and ate quietly at the small table near the window. Marcus spent most of the meal discussing potential routes North Star Freight Solutions could expand into if the investment went through. European shipping partnerships, new distribution centers, larger contracts with international companies. Normally, I would have listened carefully, but that evening, my attention drifted. There were small details I couldn't stop noticing. Marcus's phone vibrated twice during dinner. Both times he glanced at the screen quickly before turning it face down on the table. Later that night, when Marcus stepped into the bathroom to take a call, I noticed the name briefly appear on his phone screen before it dimmed again. Alyssa. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't open his messages. But the moment stayed with me. After Marcus finished the call, he returned to the room and began reviewing documents for the next day's meeting. Neither of us mentioned the phone, yet the quiet space between us seemed to grow slightly wider. That night, sleep came slowly. Marcus fell asleep almost immediately, the steady rhythm of his breathing filling the room. I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling. The name Alyssa repeated itself quietly in my thoughts. Maybe it was just business, maybe it was coincidence. But something about the timing of everything, the airport humiliation, the sudden distance in Marcus's voice, the repeated appearance of that same name, felt increasingly difficult to ignore. Have you ever noticed a small detail that suddenly made you question everything you thought you understood? Tell me in the comments. And if moments like this in the story surprised you, tap the like button. Outside the hotel window, the lights of Geneva shimmered across the lake. Somewhere deep inside me, a quiet certainty was beginning to form. Not a clear answer yet. Just the uneasy feeling that the story I thought I knew about my marriage might not be the whole truth. Morning came slowly in Geneva. For a few seconds after waking, I lay still in the unfamiliar hotel room, trying to remember where I was. The thin light filtering through the curtains had the pale softness of early morning in a foreign city. Then I remembered the airport, the torn boarding pass, the name that had appeared again and again on Marcus's phone. Alyssa. Beside me, Marcus was already awake. He stood near the window, adjusting his cufflinks, dressed in a dark suit that looked carefully pressed despite the long flight the day before. I have another meeting with Meridian this morning, he said without turning around. Just final discussions. What time? I asked. 8:30. It was barely 7. Marcus moved efficiently around the room, collecting documents and checking messages on his phone. Within minutes, he was ready to leave. I might have lunch with the team afterward, he added casually while slipping his phone into his jacket pocket. The same phrase from his calendar. Lunch? With Alyssa. All right, I said. Marcus gave a quick nod and walked out the door. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the day before. I waited until I heard the elevator doors close down the hallway before getting out of bed. The room still carried the faint scent of Marcus's cologne. His laptop sat open on the small desk near the window, where he had been reviewing documents late the previous night. Normally, I would never touch Marcus's work computer. Business documents were confidential, and I had always respected the boundary between Marcus's professional life and the rest of our home. But that morning, something felt different. Maybe it was the memory of the airport. Maybe it was the quiet repetition of a name that kept appearing in places I hadn't expected. I walked slowly toward the desk. Marcus's laptop screen had gone dark, but when I touched the trackpad, it immediately lit up again. He had never been particularly careful about passwords when we traveled together. The system opened directly to the email inbox he had been reading the night before. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I looked at the screen. Dozens of messages filled the inbox: logistics updates, investor documents, shipping contracts. The usual mixture of emails Marcus received every day while managing North Star Freight Solutions. Nothing unusual. I was about to close the laptop when I noticed a conversation thread near the top of the inbox. The subject line caught my attention: Geneva itinerary. The sender's name appeared clearly: Alyssa Grant. I clicked the message. At first, the email looked completely professional. Alyssa had forwarded several documents related to the Meridian Global Capital Meeting conference room, details, presentations, schedules, notes about the investors attending. Everything looked exactly like the type of coordination a consultant might handle. But as I scrolled down, the tone of the conversation shifted. Earlier messages appeared beneath the newest email, forming a long thread that stretched back several months. Most of the earlier messages weren't about investor meetings at all. They were about travel plans, reservations, private dinners. There were hotel confirmations from cities Marcus had visited during previous business trips: Chicago, Dallas, San Diego. Each email ended with a short line from Alyssa. "Looking forward to seeing you again. I hope this hotel works better than the last one. Let me know if you want me to book the same suite." For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. The messages were written casually, almost comfortably, as if the arrangements they described had become routine over time. I scrolled further down the thread. One message near the middle made my hands go still. Marcus had written it late at night months earlier. "Make sure the flights are separate again. It's easier if Valerie doesn't see the reservations." The cursor blinked quietly at the end of the sentence. For a moment, I didn't move. The words sat on the screen with a calm, almost casual certainty, like a small logistical note in the middle of a routine business conversation. Separate flights. My hand remained on the trackpad, but the muscles in my fingers had gone still. I read the sentence again, then once more. Outside the tall window behind me, Lake Geneva shimmered in the morning light. A small boat drifted slowly across the water, leaving a thin ripple behind it. Inside the room, the only sound was the soft hum of the hotel air conditioning. Separate flights. Suddenly, small memories from the past few months began surfacing in my mind. Marcus mentioning last-minute travel changes, emails about different departure times, trips where he insisted on handling the reservations himself, details I had accepted without question. Now the pattern appeared all at once. Not accidental, not careless, planned, carefully, quietly. The cursor blinked again, and for the first time that morning I understood something Marcus clearly believed I would never see. The sentence appeared on the screen with the quiet clarity of typed text. I read it twice, then a third time. The meaning didn't change. A strange calm settled over me as I continued reading. More emails followed. Conversations about scheduling meetings around travel plans, messages confirming restaurant reservations in cities Marcus had told me he was visiting alone. Then near the top of the thread, the most recent email appeared. Alyssa had written it only the night before. "Can't wait for lunch after the meeting tomorrow. Geneva should be beautiful this time of year." Marcus's reply sat directly beneath it. "Me too. Everything will be easier once the investment is finalized." I leaned back slowly in the chair. The quiet room seemed to shrink around the glow of the laptop screen. For months, I had believed Marcus's travel schedule was simply part of building a successful company, but the emails told a different story, a story that had been unfolding quietly while I remained at home, believing our marriage was built on the same partnership it had always been. Outside the window, the lake shimmered under the morning light, calm and unchanged. Inside the room, I closed the laptop carefully. For the first time since the airport, the uneasy questions in my mind were beginning to form into something clearer, and what I had just read made one thing impossible to ignore. Marcus's betrayal hadn't started in Geneva. It had been happening for a long time. For several minutes after closing Marcus's laptop, I remained seated at the desk. The room was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic drifting up from the streets below. Sunlight had begun spreading across the surface of Lake Geneva, turning the water into a calm mirror that reflected the pale sky. Everything outside looked peaceful. Inside my mind, the pieces of the past few months were shifting into a new pattern. The emails had answered questions I hadn't even realized I was asking. Alyssa Grant, not just a consultant, not just a coordinator for investor meetings, someone Marcus had been arranging trips with for months. Separate flights, private hotel suites, carefully planned schedules that made sure I never saw the reservations. I rested my hands lightly on the desk and tried to slow my breathing. Anger would have been easier. So would shouting, confronting Marcus the moment he walked back through the door. But something about the emails, the calm, methodical way Marcus had written them, had replaced anger with something quieter. Clarity. Marcus had not made a single careless mistake. Everything had been deliberate, which meant whatever came next would need to be deliberate too. I opened my purse and removed the torn boarding pass from the airport. The two pieces were still taped together carefully. The jagged tear ran through the printed letters of the destination. For a moment, I studied the paper again. Marcus had humiliated me publicly less than 24 hours earlier. At the time, I had assumed it was anger or frustration. Now I understood something else. Marcus had already begun pushing me out of the picture. Slowly, quietly. The emails had made that much clear. I folded the boarding pass and placed it back into my purse. Then I opened my own laptop. If Marcus believed I was simply waiting in the hotel room while he attended meetings with investors, that assumption might be useful. I began reviewing the documents I already knew well: North Star Freight Solutions contracts, partnership agreements, corporate filings that had accumulated over the years as the company grew. In the early days, I had organized many of those documents myself. Marcus handled negotiations, but I handled structure, the quiet details that made the company run smoothly. Over time, the company had grown large enough that professional accountants and lawyers had taken over most of the official record-keeping, but the knowledge of how the business had started the foundation of the company still lived in my memory. I logged into the shared document archive we used for long-term storage. Most of the files were exactly where they had always been. Shipping contracts, financial summaries, expansion plans Marcus had drafted for potential investors. Then I opened a folder labeled Meridian Proposal. Inside were the presentation materials Marcus had prepared for the Geneva meeting. Projected growth charts, distribution maps, estimated revenue increases if the investment moved forward. The numbers were impressive. Meridian Global Capital wasn't offering a small partnership. They were considering a substantial expansion deal that would push North Star Freight Solutions into international freight markets. Marcus had told me the deal might change the future of the company. He hadn't been exaggerating. But one detail stood out as I scanned the proposal documents: the investment structure. Meridian would receive a significant ownership percentage in exchange for funding the expansion. Marcus had already signed preliminary approval for the terms. My name appeared nowhere in the agreement. That alone might not have been unusual. Marcus had gradually become the public face of North Star over the years. Investors usually preferred negotiating directly with the person listed as CEO. Still, the omission felt deliberate, especially after the emails I had read earlier. I opened another document in the folder, a draft partnership summary. This version contained notes Marcus had typed into the margins for discussion during the investor meeting. Most of the comments focused on financial projections, but near the bottom of the page a short sentence appeared beneath a heading labeled Ownership Structure. Simplify domestic assets before final agreement. The wording was vague, but the implication was clear enough. If Marcus planned to restructure ownership before the investment finalized, he might be preparing to move assets out of reach. Out of my reach. I closed the file slowly. The quiet clarity I had felt earlier returned again. Marcus had already been planning the future, a future where North Star expanded internationally, a future where Alyssa appeared regularly beside him in travel plans, and possibly a future where I was no longer part of the company or the life we had built together. Outside, the morning had turned into early afternoon. Marcus's meeting with Meridian was probably reaching its final stages. Lunch with Alyssa would follow. For the first time since discovering the emails, I stood and walked to the window. The lake stretched across the city like a sheet of glass. Geneva looked calm, orderly, untouched by the quiet collapse unfolding inside one hotel room. But my thoughts felt different now. Not panicked, not confused, just focused. 16 years earlier, Marcus and I had built a company from a dining room table and a few aging trucks. Back then, we had both understood exactly how fragile success could be. Looking back now, I realized something else. Marcus believed I was still the same woman who quietly handled paperwork while he made the big decisions. He believed I would remain silent. But somewhere between the airport humiliation and the emails on his laptop, that assumption had begun to change. For the first time in years, I began thinking not about Marcus's plans, but about my own. For most of my marriage, I had believed loyalty meant patience, but standing there in that quiet hotel room, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. Sometimes the moment you finally see the truth clearly is also the moment you stop being powerless. I spent the next hour organizing my thoughts, not reacting, not panicking, just thinking. The emails had answered the question of whether Marcus had betrayed me. What they had not yet answered was how far his plans actually went, and that part mattered, because betrayal alone didn't destroy a life. Planning did. I returned to the desk and reopened my laptop. North Star Freight Solutions had grown large enough over the years that most of the day-to-day legal work was now handled by professional attorneys and financial advisors. Marcus often traveled with legal counsel when negotiating major contracts. But before those professionals ever entered the picture, there had been years when the company's structure was simple enough that Marcus and I understood every detail ourselves. Those early years had taught me something useful. Ownership rarely looked the way people assumed it did. I logged into the shared document system again and searched through the earliest corporate filings. The company had started modestly, 2 trucks, 1 warehouse lease, and a small loan Marcus had secured with the help of a local bank. But something else had existed in those first agreements. A structure Marcus himself had once insisted on. At the time, it had seemed practical. Now it looked different. North Star's domestic operating assets, the warehouse lease, several equipment purchases, and a portion of the early contract rights had originally been placed into a separate holding structure during the company's earliest expansion phase. I remembered the conversation clearly. Marcus had explained it years earlier while sitting at our dining room table surrounded by paperwork. It protects the company if anything goes wrong, he said at the time. The holding structure had eventually become less relevant once outside investors began expressing interest in the company. Over time, many of those early details faded quietly into the background of the business. Except they hadn't disappeared. They were still written into the legal framework of how North Star had grown. I reviewed several of the documents again, paying closer attention to the ownership language. Marcus had gradually become the public face of the company, but the underlying structure remained more complicated than most people realized. That complication might matter now. I opened a new document on my laptop and began listing questions. What exactly did Marcus intend to restructure before the Meridian investment? Which assets were included in the new ownership proposal? And most importantly, who currently had the authority to approve those changes? The answers were buried somewhere inside the company's legal agreements. I reached for my phone. There was one person who would understand those documents better than anyone else, Rebecca Cole. Rebecca had been North Star's corporate attorney for nearly a decade, calm, precise, and famously careful with details. She had helped guide the company through several complicated contract negotiations over the years. More importantly, Rebecca had always been someone I trusted. I hesitated before dialing her number. Seattle was still early morning, but Rebecca answered after the second ring. "Valerie," she said, sounding mildly surprised. "I didn't expect to hear from you while you were overseas." "Sorry to call so early," I said. "I just had a question about some older North Star documents." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "What kind of question?" I chose my words carefully. "Do you remember the holding structure Marcus set up during the early expansion phase? The one connected to the warehouse lease and the initial contract rights?" Rebecca didn't answer immediately. "I remember it," she said slowly. "Why I was reviewing some of the Meridian proposal documents," I said. "There's a note about simplifying domestic assets before the investment closes." Rebecca exhaled softly. "Yes," she said. "Marcus mentioned something about restructuring the domestic assets before finalizing the deal. Is that possible?" "It depends on who currently controls the assets involved." The room felt very quiet as I waited for her next sentence. Rebecca continued. "Some of the earliest agreements included joint approval requirements," she said. "It was a protective measure Marcus insisted on back then. Joint approval." I leaned back slightly in the chair. "So restructuring those assets wouldn't be automatic," I said. "No," Rebecca replied. "Not unless both parties signed off on the changes." The answer settled into place like the final piece of a puzzle. Marcus had spent months planning travel with Alyssa. He had arranged separate flights, separate hotels. He had even begun preparing to restructure North Star before accepting the Meridian investment. But one small detail from the company's earliest days still remained, something Marcus had likely forgotten, or assumed no longer mattered. Rebecca spoke again. "Valerie, is something going on?" I glanced toward the window overlooking the lake. "Not yet," I said quietly. After ending the call, I sat at the desk for a long time without moving. The pieces were finally beginning to align. Marcus believed the future of North Star depended on the Meridian investment. He believed the restructuring would happen quietly before the deal closed. And he believed I was simply waiting in a hotel room while he arranged that future. But the truth was beginning to look very different. Have you ever realized that the person who thought they had all the control might actually be missing the most important detail? Tell me in the comments, and if this moment in the story made you curious about what happens next, tap the like button. Outside the window, the late afternoon sunlight stretched across Lake Geneva. Marcus would return soon from his lunch with Alyssa. And when he did, the next part of the story would finally begin. Marcus returned to the hotel just before evening. The door opened quietly, and he stepped inside with the same calm confidence he carried after every successful business meeting. His jacket was folded neatly over his arm, and the faint smell of expensive cologne followed him into the room. "Good news," he said, loosening his tie as he walked toward the desk. "Meridian is ready to move forward." I looked up from the chair near the window. "That sounds serious." "It is," Marcus replied. "This investment could double North Star's size within a few years." He poured himself a glass of water and took a long drink before continuing. "They want to finalize the structure tomorrow morning," he said. "Just a final discussion before the official agreement." His voice carried the quiet excitement of someone who believed the most difficult part of the negotiation was already finished. "Where will the meeting be?" I asked. "Back at the Four Seasons," Marcus said. "Private conference room. Jonathan Pierce and his team will be there." Jonathan Pierce, the senior partner from Meridian Global Capital. Marcus had mentioned his name several times during earlier conversations about the deal. Pierce was known for being cautious with investments but decisive when he saw the right opportunity. Marcus sat down across from me, finally noticing the way I was watching him. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," I said calmly. "It just sounds like an important day tomorrow." "It will be." Marcus leaned back in the chair, the tension of the past 2 days seeming to ease slightly. For him, everything was falling into place. The investment, the expansion, the future he had been quietly arranging for months. He had no reason to suspect anything had changed. The next morning arrived with clear skies over Geneva. Marcus dressed quickly, reviewing notes on his phone while I finished a cup of coffee near the window. "You don't have to come to the meeting," he said without looking up. "It'll just be financial discussions." "That's all right," I replied. "I'd like to see how it goes." Marcus hesitated briefly. Then he shrugged. "Suit yourself." The conference room at the Four Seasons was quiet when we arrived. Large windows overlooked the lake, and the polished table in the center of the room had already been prepared with neatly arranged documents and water glasses. Jonathan Pierce stood near the window, speaking with 2 members of his team. He turned when Marcus entered. "Marcus," he said with a welcoming smile, "good to see you again." They shook hands. Pierce's eyes moved briefly toward me. "And this must be Valerie." Marcus nodded. "My wife." Pierce extended his hand politely. "Nice to meet you." "Likewise," I said. Everyone took their seats around the table. The Meridian team reviewed several documents discussing the financial projections and expansion strategy Marcus had prepared for North Star Freight Solutions. The conversation moved smoothly at first. Pierce asked questions about shipping routes, projected revenue growth, and potential partnerships in European freight markets. Marcus answered confidently. For nearly 30 minutes, the meeting unfolded exactly the way Marcus had expected, until Pierce opened the final document. This section concerns the restructuring of North Star's domestic assets before the investment closes, Pierce said, scanning the page carefully. Marcus nodded. "Yes, that's the last step." Pierce looked up. "We reviewed the ownership structure attached to the domestic holding agreement." Marcus's expression remained calm. That structure will be simplified before the final contract is signed. Pierce exchanged a glance with one of his colleagues. Then he placed the document on the table. That may be more complicated than you expected. Marcus frowned slightly. What do you mean? Pierce turned the page toward him. The current agreement lists joint approval authority over the domestic asset restructuring. Marcus leaned forward. That clause hasn't been relevant in years. Pierce shook his head slowly. It's still legally active. The quiet room seemed to grow even stiller. Marcus glanced down at the document again. That's just a formality, he said. It can be updated. Pierce folded his hands together. Not without the second party's approval. Marcus's gaze shifted toward me. For the first time since the airport, uncertainty flickered across his face. Pierce continued speaking calmly. We require full clarity of ownership before committing to the investment. If domestic assets are tied to joint authorization, restructuring cannot proceed without both signatures. Marcus's voice was quieter now. We'll handle the paperwork. Pierce shook his head again. I'm afraid it's more serious than that. He slid another document across the table. We conducted standard due diligence before finalizing this agreement. Your corporate attorney confirmed the clause remains enforceable. Marcus stared at the page. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was beginning to fade. Pierce spoke carefully. Without the restructuring completed, Meridian cannot finalize the investment. The words hung in the air. For a long moment, no one spoke. Marcus slowly lifted his eyes toward me. For the first time since the airport gate in Seattle, he looked uncertain. And in that moment, he began to understand something he hadn't considered before. The future he had been arranging so carefully might not unfold the way he expected. The conference room remained silent for several seconds after Jonathan Pierce finished speaking. No one rushed to fill the space. Outside the tall windows, Lake Geneva shimmered calmly under the morning light as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But inside the room, something had shifted in a way Marcus clearly hadn't expected. Marcus lowered his eyes back to the document on the table. For the first time since the airport gate in Seattle, the confidence that usually surrounded him seemed to thin slightly. This clause hasn't been enforced in years, he said quietly. Jonathan Pierce remained calm. Enforcement isn't the issue, Pierce replied. Legal validity is. He folded his hands neatly on the table. Without confirmation that the restructuring can proceed with full authorization, Meridian cannot finalize this investment. Marcus sat back in his chair. For several seconds he didn't speak. The silence felt heavier now, different from the polite pauses earlier in the meeting. The Meridian team waited patiently, their expressions neutral but attentive. Marcus glanced at me again. His eyes carried a question he hadn't asked yet, but the answer was already clear. Pierce stood. I think it's best we pause the discussion for now, he said professionally. If the ownership issue is resolved, we can revisit the proposal in the future. The meeting ended without another argument. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet sound of chairs sliding back from the table and documents being gathered into neat stacks. Marcus walked beside me through the hotel lobby a few minutes later without saying a word. Outside, the air felt crisp and cool as we stepped onto the sidewalk near the lake. Geneva moved around us with its usual calm rhythm, tourists walking along the promenade, cyclists passing quietly on the street boats, drifting slowly across the water. Marcus finally stopped walking. What did you do? He asked. The question wasn't angry. It sounded more confused than anything else. I didn't do anything, I said calmly. Marcus stared at me. That clause hasn't mattered for years. Maybe not, I replied. But it still exists. He ran a hand through his hair, something I hadn't seen him do in a long time. You knew about this, he said. I remembered it. Marcus looked out across the lake for a moment before speaking again. You're going to block the restructuring. It wasn't phrased as a question. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at the water stretching across the horizon, remembering the nights years earlier when Marcus and I had sat at our dining room table planning the future of North Star Freight Solutions together. Back then, the company had been little more than an idea and 2 aging trucks, We had built everything slowly, carefully, together. "Marcus," I said quietly, "you already started planning a future without me." He didn't deny it. That silence told me everything. For a moment, the two of us stood beside the lake without speaking. The past 16 years of our marriage seemed to hang between us like something fragile that had already begun to break long before the airport humiliation. Marcus finally exhaled slowly. "I didn't think you would notice," he admitted. I noticed. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a mistake that could no longer be undone. "What happens now?" he asked. The question felt strangely simple. I had spent the last 2 days thinking about that answer. "Now," I said, "we stop pretending everything is fine." Marcus didn't argue. Maybe he understood there was nothing left to argue about. The rest of that afternoon passed quietly. Marcus returned to the hotel to contact his lawyers and investors. I spent several hours walking along the lake, letting the calm movement of the city settle the storm that had been building inside me for months. By evening, the sun had begun to lower over the water. Geneva looked even more peaceful at sunset, the golden light reflecting softly across the lake's surface. Marcus and I spoke again briefly that night, not about the investment, not about Alyssa. Those conversations would happen later when lawyers and documents replaced assumptions and quiet suspicions. But something had already changed. The imbalance that had existed between us for months, perhaps longer, had finally been brought into the open. The next weeks unfolded slowly. Marcus returned to Seattle ahead of me to deal with the fallout from the failed Meridian deal. Investors rarely enjoyed surprises, and the unresolved ownership clause created enough uncertainty that the expansion plan quietly dissolved. North Star Freight Solutions continued operating, but the future Marcus had been planning was no longer guaranteed. When I eventually returned home, the house felt both familiar and strangely different. Ethan greeted me at the door, asking casually how the trip had gone. Long, I told him with a small smile. But it was the truth. The trip had been long in ways that had nothing to do with distance. Over the following months, Marcus and I began the slow process of separating our lives and our business. It wasn't dramatic. There were no public arguments or emotional scenes, just paperwork conversations with attorneys and the quiet realization that the partnership we once believed in had already changed. Sometimes endings arrive not with explosions, but with clarity. Looking back now, the moment at the airport gate had been the beginning of that clarity. If Marcus had never torn that boarding pass, I might have continued believing our life was still the same as it had been years earlier. But life has a way of revealing the truth when we are finally ready to see it. And sometimes the quietest moments, like standing in an airport surrounded by strangers, become the turning points that lead us somewhere entirely new. Because in the end, I learned that dignity isn't something another person can take away from you. It's something you decide to keep. Have you ever stayed silent in a moment when someone treated you unfairly, only to realize later that silence gave you the strength to change your life? Tell me in the comments. If this story made you reflect on your own experiences, consider tapping the like button so more people can hear it. And if you know someone who might need this reminder, share the video with them. Finally, if you enjoy thoughtful stories about life, relationships, and the moments that quietly change us, consider subscribing, because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that help us understand our own.